The rain in Brooklyn never really falls straight. It slants like the city itself can't decide if it wants to drown you or save you. That night, it came down in sheets, cold enough to make my teeth ache. My jacket was ripped. My hair clung to my face. And my hands, they wouldn't stop shaking. I told myself to keep moving, to breathe, to not look back. But every puddle reflected a face I didn't want to see. His face, Evan, once upon a time. He was the man who made me laugh in the mornings and promise forever at night. But some men love like fire, beautiful, until you realize it's burning down everything that ever made you feel safe. For months, I'd been running from that fire, changing me number, sleeping in spare rooms, pretending that moving faster meant healing. But he'd found me again. His voice still carried that practiced warmth, the kind that could make strangers smile, and neighbors call him such a nice guy. But underneath, I could already hear the anger simmering. He was calling my name now, dragging it through the rain, one syllable at a time. Mara. My legs were moving before my mind caught up. Down the block. Left. Across a street where cabs honked and strangers didn't care. Brooklyn, for all its noise, has places where the world disappears. I found one that night, an alley that swallowed sound like it was hungry for secrets. There was a single door there. Metal. No sign. No light. Just a faint hum from behind it. I didn't think. I knocked once. Hard enough to hurt my hand. No answer. I knocked again, and then the door opened. The first thing I noticed was the warmth soft. Golden. Wrong for a place like that? The second was the silence. Inside wasn't a warehouse or a bar. It was something else entirely. Low jazz drifted from a corner speaker. Smooth and slow. The air smelled like cedar and whiskey. And every head in the room turned toward me. Men in suits. Polished shoes. Sharp eyes that didn't blink. I froze. Water dripped from my jacket onto the floor. The sound loud enough to betray me. And then, from the far end of the room, a voice said quietly, "Let her breathe." The men went still. He stood up from a corner table. Dark hair. Black suit. Calm. Like he was carved from stillness itself. There was something magnetic about him. Not loud. Not obvious. But absolute. I'd heard his name whispered before. In conversations people pretended not to have. Luca Bianchi, the man who owned half the city and didn't need to prove it. He looked at me for a long second. His eyes tracing every tremor in my body. Not judgment, just calculation. The kind of gaze that sees everything and says nothing. "Who did this to you?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but heavy. Like it belonged to someone used to being obeyed. I started. My throat raw. It was just a mugger. Wrong place. Wrong time. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way his eyes narrowed slightly. Like a man who already knew the truth, but was giving me space to lie. He didn't ask again. Instead, he reached for a towel, handed it to me, then shrugged off his jacket and placed it over my shoulders. It was warm. Expensive. It smelled like something steady. "You're shivering," he said simply. "I'm fine." I lied. He nodded toward one of the men. "Water," he said. Nothing more, and they moved fast. Silent. One of them handed me a glass. I tried to thank him, but the words fell apart somewhere, between my fear and the lump in my throat. Then, outside, I heard it. A voice. Familiar. Too close. "Mara, I know you're here." The sound froze every muscle in my body. My fingers tightened around the glass, until I thought it would break. Luca's gaze shifted toward the door. His face didn't change, but the air did. It thickened, like the entire room was holding its breath. He stepped toward the window. Slow and deliberate. The others watched him the way soldiers watch a general. They didn't move unless he did. Evan's shadow passed by the glass. His voice came again. Slurred. Despirate. Mara. Luca spoke softly. But his words cut through the noise, like a blade. You should go, he said. His tone, calm, but final. Before I forget, I'm trying to be civilized. No shouting. No threats. Just certainty. Outside. Footsteps retreated. Then silence. Even the rain seemed to pause. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until Luca turned back toward me. His eyes softened. Just a fraction. You know him, he said. Not a question. I looked away. I did. He didn't press. He just nodded once. Then gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. And somehow, I obeyed. The leather creaked under me. The towel slipped from my shoulders, replaced by the weight of his gaze. For a while, neither of us spoke. The jazz filled the silence, slow and smooth, like time had loosened its grip on the moment. Finally, he asked, You have somewhere safe to go. I'll figure it out. That's not an answer. I met his eyes. Why do you care? He leaned back, studying me again. Because people who stop asking for help usually need it the most. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. When I tried to hand back his jacket, he pushed it gently toward me. Keep it. It suits you better. There was something in the way he said it, something that wasn't flirtation or pity. It was respect. Quiet and unexpected. For the first time that night, I felt seen. I stood to leave. But he spoke again. That same calm voice that felt less like a question and more like protection, disguised as conversation. Do you have a car? No. Then I'll have someone drive you. You don't need. He looked at me, and the words stopped. It wasn't a threat. It was gravity. The kind of look that didn't ask permission. It simply waited for honesty. Okay, I said softly. He nodded to one of his men. Get the car. The others returned to their conversations. But the room never really went back to normal. I could still feel the tension under the surface. The awareness that something had shifted. When I stepped outside, the rain had softened to a mist. The city lights glowed in puddles. Fractured and trembling, a black car waited at the curb. The driver opened the door. Before I got in, I looked back. Luca was standing at the door, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a cigarette he hadn't lit. The streetlight hit his face, catching the faint scar along his jaw. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just watched me with those unreadable eyes, the kind that remember everything. As the car pulled away, I leaned against the seat and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, the sound of rain didn't feel like a warning. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was hope. But as the city blurred past, I found myself thinking about the moment his eyes met mine. Calm. Dangerous. Unshakably certain. And I realized something I'd never admit out loud. I'd been running for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. That night, I didn't know if I'd knocked on the wrong door, or... Finally. The right one. The guest house didn't feel like it belonged to a man people whispered about. It felt like a place someone had built after losing too much and deciding order might be the only way to keep from breaking again. The floors were dark wood, quiet underfoot. The windows were large enough to hold whole skies. Everything had a place, and nothing begged for attention. It was the opposite of Evan's world. No trophies. No noisy. No mirrors demanding you prove you were worth looking at. Just clean countertops and folded blankets and a silence that let my mind unclench. Luca said it would be a few nights. He said it like a weather report. A simple fact, not a favor. He didn't look at me like I owed him. He didn't look at me like I was fragile. Either. He looked at me the way a harbor looks at a storm-beaten boat, assessing the damage without asking how it happened. The next morning, when I padded into the kitchen, he was already up. No staff. No clatter of other people trying to perform care. Just him. Sleeves rolled. Heat curling from a pan. Coffee steam rose like a small prayer. He didn't make small talk. He slid a plate across the island and set a mug beside it. The scrape of ceramic against stone sounded too loud for how careful he was being. "You eat," he said. I wasn't hungry until the fork was in my hand. Until the first bite reminded me what food tastes like when your stomach isn't knotted around. Fear. He leaned against the counter opposite me. Not watching me, exactly. But aware of me, in a way that didn't need eyes. On the edge of his desk nearby, 3 books lay open. Spines relaxed. Philosophy. Putri. War. I tried not to stare. But I did. Because they didn't fit the headline version of his name. He saw me looking and said nothing. Which told me more than explanations would have. When I reached for my mug, his gaze flicked to my wrist. The bruises faded mementos of hands that had learned too well how to tighten were a question neither of us asked. He didn't comment. He didn't pretend not to see. He just held my eyes for a second longer than comfort. Like a man silently promising, he knows the color of that kind of pain. Days became a shape. Not a routine yet. But the outline of one. He left early. Returned late. I learned the sound of his footsteps on the back stairs. I learnt the scent of his cologne on the sweater he left, draped over a chair. I learnt the rhythm of the house, how the heat clicked on at dawn. How the afternoon light pooled on the piano lid like honey, and stayed there until the sun remembered other promises. Sometimes, through a cracked office door, I heard him on the phone speaking Italian. His voice low and deliberate. Like a tide that decides everything at the shoreline. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone measured, unhurried. A kind of power that didn't require volume. When he hung up, the quiet came back and didn't apologize for the interruption. At night, when sleep skittered away and left me counting the lines in the ceiling, I wandered to the living room. The piano sat like a memory. My fingers traced the keys without pressing. I remembered the way music used to pull breath out of me when I didn't have any left. I remembered stopping because he said my playing made him feel small. It took me a long time to realize that was the point. You play. Luca's voice came from the doorway one evening. Soft enough not to startle. I used to. I said, "Why did you stop?" The truth was a simple sentence with sharp edges. It made someone angry. He was quiet for a beat that felt like he was tasting the shape of that admission. Some men get angry when they're asked to feel anything. I didn't answer. He didn't move closer. He just stayed where he was, granting me the kind of distance that feels like respect instead of rejection. In the guest house, the night grew a different kind of silence than the city. It didn't feel like being alone. It felt like being allowed to be. And then one night, the dream came back, the one where the door wouldn't lock, and my hands wouldn't work, and footsteps hurried down the hall, carrying a name like a weapon. I woke with a sound lodged in my throat. I couldn't swallow it. I couldn't breathe around it. The door opened. He didn't ask if he could come in. He didn't flick on a light. He crossed the room and put his hand on my shoulder. Steady and warm. Like you do when you're convincing a terrified animal that the world is still made of ground. You're safe here. Mara, he said. The words weren't empty. They were heavy with something that had survived a fight to be spoken. No one touches you again. Not while I'm breathing. My lungs relearned their job. My pulse slowed, where his palm pressed into bone. He waited until the quiet returned to my body. Then he eased back, left the door open just enough to let the hallway light turn the dark, gentle. The next morning, I made coffee and pancakes, because gratitude tastes better when you can eat it. He sat at the island, while I worked, watching like the act of cooking, told him some story he wanted to hear. I told him about Evan then, not as a confession, but as a kind of translation so he'd know what language my fears spoke. The charm in public, the punishments in private, the way control can be disguised as devotion. How it can take years to learn the difference. He listened, elbows on the counter, hands folded. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't curse another man on my behalf like theatre. When I finished, he said, "Men like him mistake fear for love. I don't." It could have been bravado. It wasn't. It sounded like a man who had spent years inventorying what love is and is not, if only to make sure he didn't lie to himself again. After that, the air between us changed. Not thicker, truer. I stopped saying, "I'm fine," as a reflex. He stopped waiting at doorways, like he needed permission to enter rooms where I sat. We adjusted to each other without announcing the adjustments. The house learned our names, but safety, the kind that's rare and real, has a way of making you notice every thread that could unravel it. His study door was open one afternoon when I brought in the mail. On the desk, a holster sat beside neat stacks of paper. As ordinary as a paperweight, to a life built this way. A pistol lay there, cleaned and reassembled. The black of it absolute. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The gun wasn't a surprise. It was an answer to a question I'd been avoiding. I set the envelopes down and found the window instead. The lake wind lifted the trees across the lawn. The world pretended it was simple. In town, I couldn't unhear the things people told each other when they thought they were safe being cruel. The waitress at the corner deli watched me leave and whispered to the cook. Two men at the hardware store stopped talking when I walked in and started again when I walked out. It wasn't just curiosity. It was awareness, a naming. Being near him made me visible to people I didn't want to see me. I'd spent months trying to disappear. Now, simply by standing under the same roof as the man who ruled the city, without raising his voice, I was a point on someone's map. The first time I felt it for real. The hair rose along my arms without asking my permission. I was walking back from the market, the bag handles cutting into my fingers, because I refused to let someone else carry them. A car idled too long at the corner. The windows were too dark for a day that wasn't bright enough to demand sunglasses. It rolled forward when I did. Stopped when I stopped. I stood there, pretending to answer a text, until the engine revved and slid away. Not fast. Not slow. Just sure. When I told Luca that night, he didn't ask me to describe the car. He didn't ask me why I hadn't called him. He understood the shape of the fear without needing the details. He only asked where. By the time I finished the sentence, he was already dialing. After. He rested his hands on the counter and looked at me the way you look at a fault line. "You've decided to build around. You've stepped into my world now," he said quietly. "And my world protects its own." There was a gravity to the word own that didn't feel like possession. It felt like responsibility. Like a vow that cost something to make and more to keep. I thought about leaving the next day. Because that's what people like me do, when good starts to feel like risk we run, before someone can prove us right about danger. I packed a bag. I took it to the door. I stood there with my hand on the knob and listened to the house tell me the truth, that it had been holding its breath since I arrived, waiting for me to decide if it could exhale. I unpacked. We didn't talk about the decision. We didn't have to. It was in the way he paused at the threshold of the kitchen and asked if I needed anything from town. It was in the way I started playing the piano again, when the afternoon light was the color of forgiveness. At first, Just scales. Quiet and careful. Like testing ice. Then a melody. Small and stubborn. One my mother used to hum over the sink. I heard him stop in the hall and listen. He didn't enter. He let the song belong to the room. Nights softened. The nightmares didn't vanish. But they learned new endings. Sometimes I woke to the sound of rain and didn't brace. Sometimes I fell asleep on the sofa and woke under a blanket that smelled like cedar and a man who refuses to let cold win. Once. Late. I found him on the back steps. Collar open. Tea undone. The day refusing to leave his shoulders. I sat beside him without asking if he wanted company. The air was cool enough to matter. We said nothing for a while. Silence can be a language, when two people are fluent in it. Did you ever think your life would look like this? I asked finally. He huffed a laugh that didn't reach for humor. No. I thought it would be shorter. Mine too. I said. And we both let the honesty hang there. Not as a tragedy, but as a fact that made this moment larger. He turned his hand palm up on the step between us. Not touching me. Just offering the idea of it. I watched my own hand hover. The inches between us, loud. Then I set my fingers lightly on his. Not an answer. Not a promise. Just a truth. Trying out its voice. Heat moved up my arm like recognition. He didn't grip. He didn't pull. He closed his hand around mine with the kind of care you reserve for fragile things that you want to last. The quiet electricity of safety moved through me. Gentle and insistent. And for the first time, in a very long time, I believed in a version of love that didn't require me to disappear in exchange for it. He looked straight ahead. As if staring down a road he could finally imagine. It won't get easier. He said, I don't need easy. I answered, surprised by how calm I sounded. I need real. We stayed like that, until the night remembered it had other business, and the house settled into its bones. When we finally stood, we did it together. Like people who had learned, there are some weights worth carrying, if you don't carry them alone. The walls between us hadn't fallen. They'd become windows. And when you can see through something, it stops feeling like a prison, and starts feeling like a choice. That was the first time I touched his hand. The first time safety felt like love. And love felt like a room you could walk into, without asking who you had to be to deserve it. I used to think danger only lived in fists and threats, and slammed doors. But sometimes, danger comes back, wearing the same voice that once promised forever. It happened on a Thursday. The air had that strange stillness. Before a storm, the kind of quiet that makes you listen harder than you should. I'd gone into town for groceries. Hood pulled low. The kind of habit you never unlearn even when you're safe. Then I heard it. A voice I'd buried under 6 months of silence. Mara. It wasn't shouted this time. It was coaxing. Confident. Like the sound of a man convinced he still owned the script of your life. I turned, and there he was. Evan. His smile hadn't changed. It was still the same one that fooled my friends. My parents. The world. The smile that came right before the storm. I just want to talk, he said. Palms raised like peace. Could be shaped out of gesture, but my body knew better. Fear didn't rush me the way it used to. It rose. Sure. But it didn't rule. I wasn't the same woman he'd last cornered. Before I could answer, a voice behind me broke the air in half. She doesn't need to talk. Luca. He'd stepped out from a nearby car so quietly that for a second I thought I was dreaming him. Dark coat. Rain in his hair. Eyes that didn't flicker. The calm before something irreversible. Evan's bravado faltered. Just enough for the truth to slip through. You again, he said, forcing a laugh. You think hiding behind a gangster makes her safe? Luca took a single step forward. No shouting. No theatrics. Just that low, measured voice that turned danger into art. You hurt what's mine once, he said. You don't get a second chance. The words hung there, sharp enough to draw blood on their own. Evan's smirk died. But pride wouldn't let him back down completely. You can't scare me forever, he said. Luca's reply was softer than a whisper, colder than the rain. Forever's not what I need. He didn't touch him. He didn't have to. The silence did the rest. Evan left no dramatic threats this time. No parting words. Just footsteps fading into nothing. When he was gone, Luca turned to me. His hands were empty. His eyes weren't. You okay? I nodded. But something inside me shifted. Something I hadn't named before. I wasn't trembling. My pulse was steady. The fear was still there. But it didn't own me. Not anymore. He looked at me for a long second. Then said quietly, "You did that. Not me." Later that night, sitting in the kitchen, I tried to find the right words for what had changed. He poured me tea instead of whiskey. Maybe sensing that courage doesn't always come from strong drinks. "You didn't save me," I told him. My voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. "You reminded me I was worth saving." He didn't answer first. Then he said, "Maybe that's all any of us can do for someone. Remind them." For a while, we sat like that, him in shadow, me in light. Two people who had stopped pretending to be whole alone. Weeks later, I packed a small bag. Not to run. To move forward. He watched me from the doorway as I zipped it shut. There was no anger. No plea in his face. Just quiet understanding. "You're leaving," he said. I nodded. "It's time." His hands were in his pockets. But his shoulders said what his mouth didn't. "I'm not leaving because I'm afraid." I told him, "I just need to know I can stand without leaning on anyone." "Even you." He smiled, then small. Real. Like a man proud of something that hurts. "You always could," he said. "You just forgot for a while." That night, he drove me to my new apartment. No guards. No entourage. Just us and the hum of the road. He carried my bag upstairs, set it down by the door, and lingered a moment, longer than necessary. When he left, I stood there in the half-light, realizing that sometimes love doesn't look like holding on. It looks like letting someone breathe on their own. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Too quiet. Maybe. I worked. I slept. I learned to fill the space with music again. The piano I'd avoided for years now stood in my living room. Every note sounded like a piece of myself coming back from exile. Luca called sometimes. Not every day. Just enough. "How's the music?" he'd ask. Loud. I'd say, "Smiling." He'd laugh softly. A sound I'd never imagined could belong to a man with hands that once built empires from fear. Sometimes he didn't call, and that was okay too. Safety wasn't about constant presence anymore. It was about knowing he'd come if I needed him, and that I probably wouldn't have to ask. Then one evening, I came home to find a car parked outside my building. No black suits. No tinted windows this time. Just him, leaning against the hood, holding something completely out of character. Flowers. He looked up as I approached. "You said you wanted a normal life," he said. "I did," I answered. "And you?" He smiled slow. A little unsure. Still trying to figure out what normal means. I stepped closer. "Then stay," I whispered. "Be the good part of it." He hesitated. Just a heartbeat. Then he reached out, brushed his thumb along my cheek, and said quietly, "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," I said. "That's why it matters." He handed me the flowers. I took them, fingers brushing his. And for the first time since the night I knocked on his door, I realized there was no fear left in my body, only warmth, steady and unhurried. The kind that comes when danger has finally learned how to rest. 6 months later, I found a place that looked like hope. A small brick building tucked between 2 cafes. Sunlight spilling across its sign. The Hartwell Center. A clinic for women starting over. Inside. Laughter echoed down the halls. The air smelled of coffee and something sweeter possibility. When people asked who funded it, I smiled and said a friend, because the money didn't matter. What mattered was what it built. Every morning, I turned the key and felt like I was unlocking more than a door. Sometimes. Had a visit. Never announced. Never with guards. He'd lean against the reception desk, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the walls, lined with photos of women who had learned to rebuild their lives. You built this? He'd say, we did. He'd reply, he never argued. He just nodded. That small curve of a smile, barely breaking through. He still carried danger the way some men carry a past, quietly, without apology. But when he looked at me, there was light where once there'd been shadow. Now, when I think about love, I don't think about safety the way I used to. Safety isn't locks on a door or a man with a gun. It's knowing you can stand in the dark and still reach for someone's hand without shaking. It's knowing that even the most dangerous heart can learn gentleness, if given a reason. Maybe that's what we were. 2 reasons. Disguised as people. They said love built in danger can't last. But maybe that's because they've never seen a man who learned mercy from a woman's courage. Maybe safety isn't about where you are. It's about who stands beside you when the world turns dark. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. If this story moved you tonight, take a second to like the video. It helps more hearts find stories that heal. Tell me in the comments, would you choose safety? Or a love brave enough to fight for you? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where danger meets devotion and every broken heart finds its way home again.